Infinite diversity in infinite combinations. That's an expression of Vulcan philosophy created by Gene Roddenberry to sell merchandise. Couldn't find any Edict merch on the official Star Trek website, by the way. What happened to honoring Gene's vision? Anyway, Edict may have been created to express a Vulcan ideal and get nerds to buy cheap replica pins, but it has come to represent the values of inclusion and diversity championed by the Star Trek franchise as a whole. From the very beginning, Star Trek was committed to positive representation of diversity. The crew of the USS Enterprise consisted of men and women of different races, different nationalities, and ethnic backgrounds, all working together as a team, demonstrating that equality was not only possible, but desirable, and that diversity was not a weakness, but a strength. But while the cast of Star Trek the Original Series was pretty diverse, especially for its time, there were many categories of humanity that went unrepresented. One of those categories, not the only one, certainly, but the one I'm going to talk about in this video, was disabled people. Star Trek's heart has always been in the right place when it comes to representing marginalized people, almost always, but achieving that representation has frequently been a struggle, and Star Trek's representation of people with disabilities and its attempts to dramatize their experiences has been a part of this struggle. So let's talk about how Star Trek actually deals and doesn't deal with disability. Before we get into this, I just want to put it out there that I am not a disabled person, and I'm going to try not to speak for disabled people in this video. Before writing this, I solicited opinions from Star Trek fans who are disabled on what they thought were some good and bad depictions of disability throughout the franchise. I've also read a lot of critiques of Star Trek written by disabled people. I'm not going to be merely regurgitating their thoughts here. My opinions are my opinions, but the thoughts and feelings of disabled people have definitely informed and influenced the content of this video, and I am extremely grateful to them for sharing their thoughts and giving non-disabled folks like myself a window into their experiences and how they feel Star Trek has represented or failed to represent those experiences. Now then, while disabled people weren't represented among the regulars of Star Trek the Original Series, this omission was corrected in Star Trek The Next Generation, which introduced the character of Geordi LaForge, a blind man who wears a visor, a device which translates signals from the electromagnetic spectrum into visual information, allowing Geordi to see, albeit in a manner very unlike and in some ways superior to natural eyesight. Geordi is generally regarded as an example of positive representation of people with disabilities. He was born blind, and his disability is presented as something to be accommodated, not an affliction that must be cured. Because Geordi is given the tools he needs to deal with it, his blindness is not a major obstacle, and he's able to live and thrive in his society. And in certain situations, his experience as a disabled person actually gives him an advantage, enabling him to figuratively, and sometimes literally, thanks to his visor, see things his crewmates can't. One of the best examples of Star Trek The Next Generation using the character of Geordi to provide positive representation for disabled people is an episode from TNG's 5th season, The Masterpiece Society. The Enterprise arrives at a colony that is threatened by an approaching stellar core fragment. This colony, it turns out, has been engineered, its inhabitants genetically modified to fill certain roles in the community. As a part of the genetic manipulation, many so-called flaws have been eliminated, including disabilities. So right away, Geordi finds these people a little sus. He works with Hannah Bates, one of the colony's leading scientists, to modify the Enterprise's tractor beam so that it can push the core fragment safely away from the colony. While taking a break from their work, Geordi removes his visor and Hannah asks about his blindness. At first, Geordi is apologetic, realizing the sight of his white eyes may have been shocking to Hannah, but his tone soon turns bitter as he observes that someone like him would never be allowed to exist in Hannah's society, an observation which Hannah confirms. Hannah tries to explain, saying that the founders of the colony didn't want anyone to have to suffer a life with disabilities. Who gave them the right to decide whether or not I might have something to contribute? Geordi asks. A few moments later, while explaining how his visor works, Geordi realizes how they can boost the output of the tractor beam without overloading it by adapting the compression technology the visor uses to transmit visual information to the visual cortex of Geordi's brain. Geordi grins. Wouldn't it be perfect, he says, if the answer to all of this is in a visor created for a blind man who never would have existed in your society? The modified tractor beam works, but that's not the end of the episode. Having experienced life on the outside, Hannah wants to leave the colony, but she knows she'd never be allowed to go. It would disrupt the balance of their society. So she fakes a breach of the colony's biosphere in an attempt to force an evacuation, but Geordi's visor enables him to discover Hannah's deception, since it's sensitive enough to detect even the smallest crack in the structure of the colony. Eventually, Captain Picard agrees to provide transportation to anyone who wants to leave the colony, and 23 people decide to leave, but that's not really relevant to our subject here. The point for our purposes is, Geordi's visor enabled him to see things other characters missed, not once, but twice. And that's a recurring theme for Geordi. Thanks to his visor, which he only has as an accommodation for his disability, he can do things the other characters can't do. It's the classic Marvel Comics hero setup, like Daredevil, who loses his sight but gains superhuman sensitivity in his other senses, or the X-Men, whose mutations render them social outcasts but also grant them superpowers. Geordi's disability is a limitation, but it also confers upon him an advantage. His apparent weakness becomes his strength. The Masterpiece Society also argues that the proper way to address disability is for society to provide necessary accommodations to disabled people, not to prevent disabled people from existing. After all, it is society which is ultimately the source of most of the disadvantages disabled people experience, not the disabilities themselves. Geordi can't see, but that doesn't mean he can't have a happy, fulfilling life, and it doesn't mean he can't contribute to his community. Obviously he can, and he does, as do billions of real disabled people all over the world. In the Masterpiece Society, Geordi tells Hannah that he's never been embarrassed by his blindness. That echoes something he says to Riva in the second season episode, Loud as a Whisper. Riva is a renowned mediator called in to negotiate an end to a planetary civil war. Riva is deaf and also unable to communicate vocally. When he meets Geordi, he asks, through one of his telepathic interpreters, if Geordi resents being blind or having to use a visor. No, Geordi says, since they're both part of me and I really like who I am, there's no reason for me to resent either one. Loud as a Whisper is another frequently cited example of Star Trek depicting disability and getting it right. Not only is Riva treated with great respect by pretty much everybody, when tragedy strikes and his chorus of telepathic interpreters are killed, the crew of the Enterprise take whatever steps are necessary to allow him to continue doing his job. Data learns sign language to allow Riva to continue easily communicating with others, and Riva ultimately decides to complete negotiations between the two warring factions on his own by teaching the representatives of the two sides his form of sign language. As they learn to communicate with him, he hopes, they will also learn to communicate with each other. As with the Masterpiece Society, the experience of the disabled character yields the solution to the dilemma of the episode. Riva is a positive portrayal of a disabled person in other ways, too. Before the members of his chorus are killed, he makes it clear that others are to address him directly, not his interpreters. He demands respect and isn't shy about insisting that other people treat him the way he expects to be treated. Riva also carries on a flirtation with Troy, a flirtation which is reciprocated and reminds us that Riva, and by extension disabled people in general, are interested and capable of carrying on romantic and sexual relationships. Our culture has an unfortunate tendency to infantilize disabled people, and that can often include treating them as monks when the truth is, disabled people are out there throwing down just as much as everybody else. One reason why the portrayal of Reva in Loud as a Whisper is so good is probably because the actor who plays Reva, Howie Siago, is actually deaf. And not only did he act in the episode, he also had input into the writing. Siago suggested to the producers of TNG that they make an episode featuring a deaf character. Good hustle, by the way. Do you think he played it cool? If you're looking for someone to play the deaf character, I guess I could. I might be available. Siago also came up with the episode's ending. Originally, Reva would have learned to speak in order to complete the negotiations. Having Reva teach the warring factions sign language was Siago's idea. There are other positive portrayals of physical disability in Star Trek, but unfortunately there are also quite a few that aren't so positive. One that I've seen brought up more than any other as an example of Star Trek getting it wrong is an episode from the second season of Deep Space Nine, Melora. A new crew member, Ensign Melora Paslar, arrives on the station. She's an Elasian. And the thing about Elasians is their planet has much lower gravity than most other Federation planets. So, in order to function in an environment with higher gravity, she needs special accommodations. Because of the limitations of Deep Space Nine's anachronistic Cardassian technology, the best accommodation possible is a wheelchair. The station has also been modified to make it as accessible for her as possible. Bashir is already treating Melora as an inspiration porn star before she even arrives. He excitedly tells Dax about how he's studied her personnel files and knows that she refuses any and all special treatment as long as her basic needs are met. She's extraordinary, Bashir says. Now, on the one hand, this all seems super problematic. Well-meaning but misguided non-disabled people giddy at the impending arrival of an extraordinary disabled person. It feels patronizing to me, and I'm not even a disabled person. But, on the other hand, it's Deep Space Nine, which is a pretty smart show. So you figure, well, this all must be going somewhere. And it is. Sort of. So Melora arrives on the station, and right away she notices something wrong. Bashir has modified the wheelchair she requested. He did it in order to increase the chair's vertical clearance to give Melora the maximum amount of access to the station, but he apparently didn't consult with Melora before doing it. And since she's been practicing on another chair, a chair that was constructed to the exact specifications she sent to Bashir, this is just one more thing to which she has to adapt, and unexpectedly at that. This is where the real problem with the episode starts to become apparent. It's not with Melora's character. She's short-tempered and combative, but that attitude is justified by her experience as a disabled person who is constantly having her life made even more difficult by well-meaning but clueless people trying to help her. Melora is actually kind of awesome, and not in an inspiration porn kind of way. She's tough, she's independent, she doesn't take shit from anybody. Lots of critiques of the episode place the problem with the other characters, how our cast of supposedly evolved and enlightened 24th century people react to Melora, and I think that's fair, but for me there's an even deeper issue than that. Let's take another look at that interaction between Bashir and Melora over the wheelchair. Before Melora arrives, Bashir, Dax, and O'Brien are talking about the wheelchair and about how difficult it's been to make the Cardassian-designed Deep Space Nine more accessible. Bashir mentions that he's modified the chair to increase its vertical clearance. Dax and O'Brien each have a line, and then Bashir, with a twinkle in his eye, speaks admiringly of how Melora refuses any special assistance beyond her basic needs. He also tells Jadzia that when Melora deactivates the gravity in her quarters so she can move around more freely, it will be, quote, something to see. Melora exits the airlock, sits down in her chair, immediately notices that Bashir has modified the design. Bashir offers to replicate another chair, one to the exact specs she sent, but Melora's like, nope, never mind, I'll just get used to it. And she starts up the corridor, Bashir following behind with a tight-jawed, here we go, expression on his face. The problem I have with this scene, and with the episode as a whole, is that we're being cued to sympathize with Bashir rather than with Melora. She doesn't come across as unreasonable or ungrateful. The portrayal isn't nearly that bad, but we see Bashir's pride in modifying the chair, his excitement at Melora's coming aboard. He seems to view her as some sort of special project, and when Melora is less than thrilled at his changes to the chair, he seems crestfallen. When she enters her quarters and shuts the door, denying Bashir and Dax the sight of her floating around in a zero-gravity environment, we leave the scene on the image of the disappointed and slightly flummoxed Bashir and Dax walking away. Throughout the episode, we're invited to identify not with Melora, but with the non-disabled characters, particularly Bashir. This in and of itself isn't unusual. Bashir is a regular, of course we're supposed to identify with him, but Melora is one of the only examples in Deep Space Nine of a character, regular, recurring, guest star, whatever, with a visible physical disability that is shown to significantly impact her ability to interact with her environment. And she is one of only a handful of characters in the entire Star Trek franchise to have used a wheelchair. Star Trek shows have centered guest characters before. It's not unprecedented. It would have been nice if one of the only episodes to feature a physically disabled character had actually been about that character, rather than about the non-disabled people surrounding her and struggling to deal with her. These issues are amplified by the story of the episode, which eventually focuses on Dr. Bashir's efforts to cure Melora of her disability by allowing her neuromuscular system to better adapt to higher gravity. Receiving the treatment would allow Melora to get around without a wheelchair in standard gravity environments, but it would also mean she couldn't return to her low-gravity home planet because of some technobabble about how alternating between higher and lower gravity would eventually break her brain or something. Ultimately, Melora decides not to undergo the treatment. It would make it easier for her to get around on starships and space stations, but it would change who she is, and she likes who she is. So, similar to what Geordi says in the episodes I talked about before. Doesn't seem like a problem, but Melora's disability is still ultimately framed not as something to be accommodated, but as an affliction to be cured. A lot of disabled folks who I've read or heard from personally find this offensive. Also, Melora's disability can be cured because it's circumstantial. She's not disabled in her native low-gravity environment, only in higher Earth-like gravity. Most disabled people don't have the option of a cure for their disability, which means that while Melora may represent them on screen, a significant portion of her story in this episode is devoted to a kind of experience they haven't had and may never have. Like I said, Melora is a guest character. After the DS9 episode named for her, we never see her again, but there have been instances where regular characters have dealt with disability, albeit temporarily. Some have been good, some have been bad, some have been a little bit of both. For an example of that last one, let's look at what happens to Worf in another episode from TNG's 5th season, Ethics. This is the episode where an empty barrel falls on Worf and breaks his spine, paralyzing him, and he's immediately like, "Hey, kill me." Now, it's not the portrayal of Worf in the episode that I have a problem with. Like Melora, Worf's reactions to his disability and the way people treat him as a result of it are mostly sympathetic. He comes from a culture where physical prowess is highly regarded and where suicide is considered the most honorable course of action for someone with his kind of injury. I don't think death is automatically preferable to living with paralysis, and neither do most real disabled people, so far as I can tell, but it's understandable why Worf might feel that way. There are other things about Worf's reaction to his injury and resulting disability that ring true for people who have had similar experiences. Erin Hawley reviewed this episode several years ago on her blog, The Geeky Gimp, and describes how, when Dr. Crusher proposes that he use orthotic devices to regain some of his mobility, Worf's indignant reaction, quote, "I will not be seen lurching through corridors like some half-Klingon machine, the object of ridicule and disgust," unquote, rings true. Hawley writes, quote, "This scene is a good exploration of how society/disabled people/doctors view adaptive devices. Worf's discomfort in using them, his embarrassment in being seen with them, is true in both disabled people and society. I'm not saying disabled people should be embarrassed by using various devices. We absolutely should not. I want to stress that. But internalized ableism often leads to that feeling. Society tends to stare and feel uncomfortable when they see someone with adaptive equipment. Media teaches us that crutches, wheelchairs, canes, artificial limbs, and other devices are not attractive. All of this is internalized by the person with a disability. That's why disability pride is so important, because we need to counteract this nonsense. The episode also does a good job, I think, of portraying the struggle Worf's crewmates experience as a result of his request for assisted suicide. Not everyone's reaction is good, and I'll get to what I think are two really bad reactions in a second, but overall, it's portrayed as a difficult situation for everybody, and no matter what side they come down on, Worf's friends are conflicted between their desire to respect Worf's beliefs and their own beliefs that, with time and therapy, Worf can still lead a fulfilling life. Picard comes down on the we should honor Worf's wishes regardless of our personal feelings side, while Riker, whom Worf has requested be the one to actually help him perform the suicide ritual, lands squarely in the this is sick, I ain't doing it, get Alexander to stab you instead camp. Both characters are given a chance to say their piece. Both have understandable reasons for feeling as they do. Counselor Troi, on the other hand, once again demonstrates why she's not all that good at her job. Following his accident, Worf doesn't allow his son, Alexander, to visit him. It's the old, I don't want him to see me this way deal. With Worf out of action, the responsibility of looking after Alexander falls to Troi, who goes to Worf and tells him that Alexander wants to see him. Worf's like, right, but I told you I don't want to see him, and I told you why, so, why are we talking about this? It's a matter of honor? Can't you just respect my wishes? And Troy's like, I think instead of lying here worrying about your honor and feeling sorry for yourself, you should think about your son, you asshole. Easy there, senior mental health care provider on the ship. When did harshly guilt-tripping a recently paralyzed accident survivor become a valid therapeutic technique? I get that Deanna has been spending time with Alexander and she's concerned about helping him through this experience as well, but Jesus Christ, the dude is literally suicidal and she's like, think about somebody else for a change, you selfish prick. Yikes. And the other medical professional in the show's regular cast doesn't do any better. Dr. Crusher's interactions with Worf are fine. She avoids shaming the suicidal paralyzed man, but her attitude toward Worf's desire to end his own life is incredibly shitty and insensitive. Dr. Russell, a specialist, comes aboard the Enterprise to consult on Worf's case. She's pretty shady, has a really bad habit of giving patients untested drugs, and she tells Worf about an extremely sketchy surgery that, if successful, could restore 100% of his mobility. Crusher's pissed at Russell for even mentioning it to Worf, which is understandable, but later on, Picard visits Crusher in her office to talk about Worf, and that's when Crusher loses me. Picard's like, so, hey, I think you should let Dr. Russell do the sketchy surgery on Worf. And Crusher says, no, that would be super irresponsible. There's no evidence that surgery would even work, and if it doesn't work, it'll kill him. Picard's like, I get it, but if you don't do the surgery, he's just going to kill himself anyway. Crusher's like hell he will. Not in my sick bay. I'll put a force field around him and keep him under guard before I let that happen. Paralyzed people can still live very full lives, and there are conventional therapies that can restore some of his mobility, so he's just going to have to learn to accept his condition. And Picard's like, have you met Worf? Crusher's like, he ain't killing himself, and he ain't getting no surgery. Nuts to you, nuts to Dr. Russell, nuts to this whole thing! Dr. Crusher's position makes sense up to a point. She's right. Paralyzed people can and do lead full, happy lives. And she's a doctor, a healer. Naturally, she'd rather steer Worf toward treatment than see him kill himself. And she's right to be extremely skeptical about Dr. Russell, her methods, and her untested miracle spinal surgery. I don't have a problem with any of that. But she makes no effort whatsoever to see things from Worf's point of view, to take his feelings into account. She's not just a doctor. She's a doctor on a spaceship full of aliens from a wide variety of cultures, a spaceship which also visits many other planets which also have their own unique cultures. This can't be the first time she's encountered a patient with beliefs that run contrary to her own values as a physician. She seems way, way too dismissive of where Worf is coming from here. I want to talk about one more complicated portrayal of physical disability in Star Trek. It's another character who is disabled as the result of an accident, who is treated with some respect, but whose disability is also presented as a fate worse than death. I'm talking, of course, about the guy who was originally supposed to be the lead protagonist of Star Trek: The Original Series, who returned to the franchise in Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, and who is about to be the lead protagonist of Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, Captain Christopher Pike. Because the pilot episode of Star Trek, The Cage, wasn't shown during the show's original run, the first appearance of Captain Pike in terms of air dates is The Menagerie. The only two-part episode of classic Trek aired midway through the show's first season. In The Menagerie, Pike, Captain Kirk's predecessor as commanding officer of the Enterprise, is unable to walk or speak as a result of exposure to massive amounts of delta radiation. He can move around and communicate thanks to his beep chair, which allows him to respond to yes-no questions, 1 beep for yes, 2 beeps for no. All in all, he doesn't seem to be having such a good time. As I said, other characters treat him with great respect, superficially anyway, but he's presented as a pathetic figure, to be admired for his heroism and resilience, but to be pitied too. The Menagerie consists mostly of repurposed footage from The Cage, surrounded by a frame story involving Spock stealing the Enterprise in order to deliver the now-disabled Captain Pike to Talos 4, where the telepathic powers of the Talosians can create an illusion that will allow Pike to live out the rest of his life unaware of his disabilities. For the story to make sense, Spock risks his career to deliver his former captain to Talos. Pike's disability has to be presented as an intolerable fate. That in and of itself is problematic. Not exactly a positive portrayal of a disabled person, but it's made worse by how Pike is depicted in the frame story as having no agency whatsoever. Not only does Spock take it upon himself to abduct Pike and take him to Talos, having apparently never discussed it with Pike beforehand, when Pike indicates that he's not on board with this whole plan by repeatedly saying no through his beep chair, Spock ignores him. Because of the structure of the Menagerie, we're constantly seeing the two versions of Pike contrasted against each other, and the conclusion we're supposed to reach is pretty clear. Pre-accident Pike, good. Post-accident disabled Pike, bad. This impression is also conveyed when a pre-accident Pike, now played by Ensign Mount, appears during Star Trek Discovery's second season, and, in the episode Through the Valley of Shadows, experiences a vision of his future after touching a time crystal. The scene where he encounters his future self in the beep chair is shot like a horror movie. Pike's destiny to become a disabled person is literally a nightmare. And look, dramatically, it's a good scene. I've said in past videos that Ensign Mount's anguished, shaken reaction to the vision of the time crystal is one of the acting high points of that season of Discovery, and I imagine pretty much any non-disabled person who learned that they would eventually have to live with a disability that seriously curtailed their mobility and communication would treat that as bad news. It's understandable to show Pike in the beep chair as an unwelcome outcome, especially when we're in Pike's perspective and he's forced to confront it unexpectedly. But even with that allowance, it's pretty over the top. Writing about Pike's vision of his looming disability for That Shelf, film critic Angelo Moretta says, quote, There is, to be sure, science fiction potential in the conceit of Pike being seized by a haunting vision of what is to become of him, infected by his own apparently unavoidable physical and psychic trauma before it has even happened. One cannot help but be struck, though, by the imaginative paucity of this imagery, and at how easily a science fiction franchise that has envisioned seemingly infinite alternative futures and alien civilizations over its more than 50-year history has been reduced to pronouncing the mere act of sitting in a wheelchair as a grim, unforeseen ending, rather than either a new beginning or a continuation in a different form. One does not have to be disabled, though perhaps it helps, to marvel at how the very idea of a character someday sitting in Pike's chair seems to undo Roddenberry's entire utopian project, trading its creator's vision of boldly going where no one has gone before for a hackneyed image that obviously comes from places where plenty of horror filmmakers have gone before. The disabled body as a terminal point, something to scream about in terror, and the embodied sign of no livable future at all. Indeed, the notion of the disabled body as symbolic of having no livable future is refuted by the casting of Star Trek Discovery. When Pike visits the Klingon monastery where he experiences his time crystal vision during Through the Valley of Shadows, he's escorted by Tenavik, a Klingon monk played by Kenneth Mitchell, who also played the Klingons Kol and Kol Shah. In 2018, Mitchell was diagnosed with ALS, the degenerative neurological disorder also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. He now uses a wheelchair. In Discovery's third season, Mitchell appears in several episodes as Aurelio, a scientist and ally of the villain Osira. The character of Aurelio and the actor who plays him both demonstrate that a disabled body is not a terminal point beyond which there is no livable future, but rather, as Moretta says, a continuation in a different form, something which I find much more compatible with the hopeful depiction of the future we've come to expect from Star Trek. Up to this point, I've been talking about the portrayal of people with physical disabilities in Star Trek, but physical disabilities are not the only kind. There are also disabilities related to mental health. Star Trek has depicted mentally ill and neurodivergent people too, and it hasn't always been so good. In fact, Star Trek has a long and unfortunate history of portraying people with mental illnesses, people who have experienced psychological trauma, and neurodivergent people as unstable and dangerous. In Star Trek the original series, we had Garth of Izar in Whom Gods Destroy, and Lenore Caridian in The Conscience of the King, and I have to acknowledge some personal guilt related to that last one. Lenore has been a recurring character on the unofficial Star Trek podcast, The Ensign's Log, that I'm in alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole. Lenore's emotional instability and the bloody excesses she is pushed to because of it become important plot elements in our third season and are often played for laughs. It's difficult to judge how problematic our depiction of Lenore is because I'm kind of in the middle of it, but I have no doubt we could have done a better job with it than we did. And to reference Lenore from TOS without mentioning that we also used her in the Ensign's Log just would have been weird. So, there you go. If there is a bright side to the negative depictions of mental illness in Star Trek, it's that there's usually at least some lip service paid to the fact that they can be helped. Garth of Izar does become a genocidal megalomaniac as a result of a trauma, but at the end of Whom Gods Destroy, thanks to a new drug, he seems much more stable and lucid. Yes, mentally ill is presented as synonymous with criminally insane, but at least it's not a permanent condition beyond all treatment. Unless you're Lore. He just has an evil brain, I guess. There are more positive depictions, of course. Nog's psychological trauma following the amputation of his leg in Deep Space Nine's 7th season is dealt with seriously and sensitively. The episode devoted to it, It's Only a Paper Moon, places Nog in the role of the wounded veteran struggling to navigate serious injuries, both physical and mental, and is often cited as one of the best shows of the entire series. It shows us that it can take more than being fitted for a prosthetic limb to recover from an amputation, that disabilities aren't always easy to live with, but they can be managed. As Nog says to Lita at the end of the episode, "I'm not okay, but I will be." Probably the most prominent depictions of neurodivergent characters in the franchise are also mostly positive. While the callous mockery initially directed toward him by his crewmates isn't what we'd expect from supposedly enlightened 24th century humans, Lieutenant Barclay himself is a strong, admirable character. Yes, his neuroses are often played for laughs, but he's also given the opportunity to talk about his own experiences and how they differ from those of his more neurotypical crewmates in a way that feels honest. And he's shown to be a capable and valuable member of the team aboard the Enterprise D. The same can be said of Ensign Tilly on Star Trek Discovery. Like Barclay, her awkwardness and anxiety are sometimes presented as funny, but those traits don't define her, nor do they prove insurmountable obstacles to her leading a full life or pursuing a successful career in Starfleet. Speaking of Star Trek Discovery, I should mention that it establishes Spock as neurodivergent as well. In the episode Light and Shadows, Spock's parents, Sarek and Amanda, reveal that he has dyslexia, which significantly impacted his life as a child, especially because it was a rare condition on Vulcan and Spock wasn't given the support he needed to adapt. Didn't wind up holding him back all that much in the long run. Sarek was still a dick about it, though, which sucks, but, pretty on brand for Sarek. We can find another, less positive depiction of neurodivergent people on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where we meet a group of people living with pronounced psychiatric disabilities that have resulted from genetic engineering. The 4 members of the group, Jack, Lauren, Patrick, and Serena, are patients at a Federation facility referred to vaguely and somewhat ominously as the Institute, and they visit DS9 along with their psychiatrist, Dr. Lowe's, in the 6th-season episode, Statistical Probabilities. The 4 patients from the Institute present a varied assortment of disorders and eccentricities. You might say they put the diverse in neurodiversity. If you wanted to, never mind. Anyway, Jack is hyperactive and aggressive, Lauren is super horny, Patrick is gentle and childlike, and Serena is catatonic. And when they combine, they form Rain Man Voltron. Why am I so quippy all of a sudden? I must have been getting tired by the time I got to this point in the script. That joke doesn't really work anyway. Super horny was not one of Raymond's characteristics. I guess filmmakers in the late 1980s didn't think we were ready for an autistic savant who fucks. Which, our loss, I guess. Bashir wants to give the group something productive to do to prove that they can contribute positively to society, so he arranges for them to have access to classified information related to the war with the Dominion, which they can examine for details others may have missed because they're all intuitive geniuses. Within a few hours, the foursome has produced a data analysis predicting that the Federation will lose the war at a cost of billions of lives, and that the only way to save all those lives is for the Federation to surrender to the Dominion immediately. Captain Sisko listens to this surrender to the evil shapeshifters from the other side of the galaxy proposal, and he's like, nah. So the foursome take matters into their own hands, tie up Bashir, and attempt to deliver secret Starfleet battle plans to Dominion leaders Weyoun and Damar so that they can end the war as soon as possible. Bashir convinces Serena to release him in time to stop the other 3 from meeting with Weyoun and Damar, and because they weren't able to successfully commit treason, Sisko agrees to just let it slide. And then it's back to the Institute with you! Especially you ornery little scamp. Ornery, horny, hornery? The members of the foursome are obviously able to contribute to society, and the episode suggests that confining them to the Institute, which Kira speculates at one point was probably not a very stimulating environment for them, may have worsened their disorders rather than helping them. But The concerns that led them to be institutionalized in the first place are validated when they react to their proposal being rejected by imprisoning Bashir and attempting to hand over Starfleet military secrets to the Dominion. There's also the fact that their disorders are the unintended side effects of genetic engineering. Jack, Lauren, Patrick, and Serena are all clearly intended to be read as autistic, and the framing of autism as an injury that has been inflicted on someone or as something that necessarily manifests in the form of socially debilitating disorders is a problem. Writing about statistical probabilities on his blog, Another Gamer Guy, Sean Mencken says, quote, "The problem is explicitly tying autism to something that has been repeatedly described as unnatural is hurtful. Not only that, but having them spend their lives quarantined from the rest of society is indicative of a society that cannot handle the neurodivergent and has upgraded facilities with the intent of keeping these people out of sight, out of mind. It's a damning statement of the Federation, because it isn't questioned at all." Jack, Lauren, Patrick, and Serena return in a 7th season episode, Chrysalis, but the focus this time is really on Serena, who undergoes a treatment which cures her of her nonverbal condition. And as you might have guessed just from that brief summary, this episode is one of the most frequently cited example of a not-so-great portrayal of disability in Star Trek. Depicting autism as something to be cured or an autistic person as someone who needs to be fixed is offensive to many autistic people. But that's not the only problem with this episode. Once Serena is cured and able to express herself freely, Dr. Bashir does what any mature, responsible doctor would do with a patient under his care and becomes Serena's boyfriend. Might seem gross at first, but by the time they hook up, the episode has already established that Bashir is super lonely, so it's okay. Actually, that's not being fair to the episode. Bashir's relationship with Serena is screamingly inappropriate, and other characters notice and say so, particularly Chief O'Brien, who warns Bashir that his relationship with Serena is moving pretty fast and reminds him that, she's his patient. When Bashir tries to dodge that one by saying he's transferred Serena's care to another doctor, O'Brien seems skeptical. Scenes like that, which indicate an awareness of the wrongness of Bashir's relationship with Serena, help to make this episode not as bad, in my opinion, as in the opinions of a lot of other people. But Bashir's relationship with Serena is still mostly portrayed as romantic, which is problematic, and the fact that the episode uses a disabled person getting treatment as a starting point for a love story centered on one of the non-disabled regulars is more than a little icky. Ultimately, when we consider how Star Trek deals with disability, we end up with a mixed bag. There are other examples of positive and negative portrayals of disabled people that I haven't mentioned. Please let me know about any particularly egregious omissions in the comments. But really, when I look at the franchise as a whole, its worst sin as far as representation of disabled people isn't how positive or negative it is, but how sparse it is. Yes, I can point to many instances of disabled people being depicted in Star Trek, but those depictions are sprinkled across over 50 years and more than 650 hours of television episodes and movies. Those relatively few exceptions aside, the celebrated utopian society of the Federation is one that doesn't seem to include disabled people, or at least not visibly disabled people. We Star Trek fans like to wax poetic about the bright, optimistic future presented in Star Trek, but disabled people have to look a lot harder than non-disabled people to find themselves in that future. The thing is, it doesn't have to be that way, and hopefully it won't continue to be that way. When I asked people on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube for examples of representation of disabled people in Star Trek, one positive example that came up again and again was this guy. He's a background character, a member of the ship's crew on Star Trek Discovery. The actor who plays him is named George Alavizos, but his character's name hasn't been established. He uses a wheelchair, and he's just there. Part of the fabric of the show, doing his job just like everyone else. The point isn't to say that all representation of disabled people should come in the form of silent, anonymous background characters. Obviously, it doesn't, and it shouldn't. There need to be more prominent disabled characters and more stories centered on disabled people, including stories that aren't necessarily about their disability. But when you see a character like the crewman portrayed by George Alavizos, someone not playing a major role in the story, but nevertheless part of the world, it reminds you that he and people like him exist and matter and belong. And that shouldn't just be the case in a fictional future to which we aspire, but here and now, as a necessary condition of our society that we have all fought to establish and defend. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope I handled the subject okay. Like I said already, if there are any examples of portrayals of disabled people from Star Trek I didn't mention that you think I should have, please let me know in the comments. If you disagree with any of the examples I did include, or you see them differently than I do, let me know as well. I know I'm sort of straying from my lane here, but this was one of my most requested video topics ever, and it won the poll the first time it was an option, so I hope I did okay. If I did do okay, the credit has to go to all of you who responded to my tweets and Facebook posts and YouTube community posts about this, who shared your experiences as disabled people and offered your own suggestions and opinions of when Star Trek has gotten representation of disabled people right and when it's gotten it wrong. Like I said near the beginning, the script for this video was shaped and informed by your input, and I really appreciate it. I also want to specifically thank the writers whose work I quoted in this video: Aaron Hawley of The Geeky Gimp, Angelo Moretta of That Shelf, and Sean Menken of Another Gamer Guy. Their writing was invaluable as I was scripting this video. Their info is linked in the description of this video. Now, before I go any further, I also want to thank some of my newest Patreon patrons. And their names are Schwa, thank you Schwa, Duckminster Quick, thank you Duckminster, Mike Morrow, thank you Mike, Blanchemont Press, thank you Blanchemont Press, Anthony Gamboa, thank you Anthony, Valentino Feltrin, thank you Valentino, Michael Benfield, thank you Michael, Christoph Horschitz, thank you Christoph, and Alice L. Watson, thank you Alice. Those are the names of my newest patrons to pledge $5 a month or more. If you'd like to support my work, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives. A pledge of any amount from $1 on up gets you access to the Patrons Only feed, where you can vote in the polls to choose upcoming Trek Actually topics, and you can also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. But $5 a month or more gets you a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. And also, don't forget you can pledge annually instead of monthly, and when you pledge annually, you get a 10% discount. If you like my Trek Actually videos, you might also like the Star Trek-themed comedy podcast I'm a part of, alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole. It's called The Ensign's Log. We've just begun our 4th season, and we have literally jumped ship. Jason, Dana, and I play low-ranking officers serving aboard a certain famous starship that is embarking on a continuing mission to go where no one has gone before. We have a great time creating our own stories alongside what's happening in actual Star Trek episodes, playing in the sandbox, poking fun at Star Trek, and since we're now set in the early years of TNG, there's plenty to make fun of. Links are in the description. Please do give a listen to the Ensign's Log. I also want to remind you that Dana and I do a weekly watch-along live stream right here on my channel. It's called Trek Reluctantly, and we alternate watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which Dana has never seen before, and Firefly, which I have never seen before. It's live every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You queue up the episode on your end, press play when we tell you, pause when we tell you, and we watch and chat about the show. and also whatever is on Dana's mind, which may have absolutely nothing to do with the show. If you can't make it live, all the episodes are archived. The playlist is linked in the video description. You can watch whenever you want, but we sure would love it if you could join us live for Trek Reluctantly. Now that the plugs are out of the way, let's talk about next month's episode. The topic of next month's Trek Actually video was chosen by those of you who voted in the most recent poll, but it was suggested by Richard Smith. So Richard, thanks for suggesting this topic, and everyone who voted for it, thanks for selecting it for the next video. That topic is how Star Trek Deep Space Nine actually saved the Ferengi. That should be a good one. Looking forward to it. That's next month. The new topic poll goes up the same day as this video is published, so if it's not up by the time you're watching this, it will be soon. Don't forget to vote if you're a patron or thinking of becoming a patron. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.